So calling to order this Board Commissioner Policy Committee meeting at 3:34 p.m. on Tuesday, June 16th. On our agenda today, we're going to talk about the planning for this school year 2021 calendar for the Policy Committee, Policy JJIC, the academic eligibility for interscholastic athletics, and then changes and implications for policies due to COVID. So with that, I'm not sure who's presenting or chatting with us about the calendar. I'm guessing it's Joe, but I will turn it over to staff.
Hi all. So I'm sharing my calendar here. So every year, it's a pretty good process of collaboration amongst chiefs and each departmental staff members to really come up with a list of policies that they either want to be updated or policies that they want to create. So this year we were really mindful of trying to slow down the amount of policies that we've been bringing since we started this policy committee a few years ago. We've been averaging 2 to 3 policies a month, which has been great as far as, converting a lot of board rules to policies, but now we're really trying to be more mindful of our engagement process, which is obviously a big part of any policy. So the lower amount of policies, allows us to do more engagement. So what you see on your screen now is our proposed policy calendar for this upcoming year. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, we haven't had new policies introduced since March, and some policies we've already introduced in a first reader format that have already gone to policy committee. An example of that would be gifted and advanced learning. So some of these you'll notice you might have seen in some way, shape, or form. Nursing mothers, I believe, was scheduled to go the month that we stopped doing policy committee. But then there are some new ones that, for example, our new chief legal officer, Joshua Sivan, suggested that we do EGB, which is intellectual property / copyright. So that's scheduled for August. And our chief, Tina Hike-Hubbard, suggested we do a media relations policy. So this calendar is kind of an amalgamation of policies that were shifted from last year, new policies. So you'll see a bunch of things. And for example, January 19th of 2021, you'll see JKA student discipline, which was actually scheduled for a third reader. So, but this is a policy where we feel like the more engagement we could do with the community, with staff members, internally, externally, it could only help. So that's why that one isn't until January, even though it was already scheduled for third reader. So I asked all chiefs to be at this meeting to answer any specific questions about policies or for them to send their special assistant. And I know I saw Shahrazad and Josh Sivan on the call, so they could also speak to a lot of this. So I'm definitely open to answering or taking notes for any future questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. So, and welcome, Commissioner McFadden. One question that I know the commissioners are going to have off the bat is, where are we in converting board rules to policies? Do you have a sense of how much of the lift has already been accomplished or how much is outstanding?
Yeah, so I don't have a percentage per se, but I can say that we do have a lot that have been converted over the last couple of years. And then something that we're looking at now that we've had so many policies is there is a lot of overlap between policies that we've created in response to board rules. So before we start jumping back into changing board rules, I think we need to take a more cohesive approach to looking at the new policies that we've created from board rules and then seeing if we could add to policies that we already have board rules that we haven't touched yet. So rather than creating a brand new policy for each board rule, which is something that we've kind of been doing, we're going to try and slow down and really take a look at what board rules still need to be changed and roll those into policies we have. So this way we have a manageable number of policies and so it's easier for families, students, staff to really pick a policy and look at it rather than kind of guess because of how many there are. So right now I'm part of a work group that is really taking a deep dive throughout this year into the different policies that we have. And that's definitely something that we are going to be taking a look at over this year. So for next calendar year, that will definitely be reflected on the policy committee calendar.
Okay. I have several other questions about the proposed calendar, but before I go to my questions, Before I go to my questions, I'll turn it over to Commissioner McFadden and Commissioner Brooks to see if they have specific questions up to this point. So Dr. Brooks, you want to go first?
Hi, Joe. Thank you for that. One of the questions that I have is really around what you were just talking about. What I found to be really useful was the breakdown of each policy and regulation in that Word doc. And I was wondering, given that I'm also new, is there a way for me to see all of the other outstanding rules that need to be converted over so that I can have a comparison to see where we are and where we've come from and where we need to go?
Yeah, absolutely. If I wasn't sharing my screen, I'd be able to walk you through it, but there is a section on board docs. I could type up a tutorial about if you shift, you could click the arrow from board policies to board rules, and then you could see which ones we still need to convert. If a board rule has changed into a policy, on board docs, it will say this board rule has been replaced by board policy EGB. So everything is kind of cataloged in there and it's all on board docs. So I can follow up after this meeting's over with a tutorial on how to do that.
And Joe, this is Christian. I'll add the board office also produced a document of board rules that have been converted and that still need to be converted. So we'll share that as well.
Yeah, and Christian, is that in a Word format?
I believe it was I think we sent a Word and a PDF, but I can send both.
Okay, yeah, that would be helpful because it was just really good to be able to see the layout of things. And then also before I move into some more specific questions, Joe, specifically for this calendar, what am I trying to say? Come back to me. Let me give me a second to get my thoughts together, and then I'll jump back in.
Of course, absolutely. And I just posted Christian a note and request that he sends those documents to the entire board, because while the board policy committee is sort of a clearinghouse, first step conversation point in policies, the whole board will want to be in the know on that one. So Commissioner McFadden, do you have comments, questions?
Please forgive my tardy today. I was in between something else. So good afternoon, everyone. Going back to those board rules, it would have been helpful, Christian, if we had that for this meeting too, because I'm also curious to know the progress that we have made since this process has started. And Joe, I think you raised a good point. And, cross-checking existing policies and the overlap, all of that is important. But I think that I guess we just have to go back through it once it's resent to all of us. We just get a lot of information, so it'll just be helpful to see that where we are in the process of converting those rules into policy and getting rid of things that are not needed. Outside of that, I don't really have much. I think Commissioner James, when we spoke previously, it was more along these lines, just figuring out where we were in the process of converting from those rules to now. And outside of that, I'm really just going to lend the conversation to you and Dr. Brooks, and I'll chime in as I need to.
Okay, perfect. Dr. Brooks, did you want to jump back in?
Wait, I'm sorry though. Excuse me.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious to know why, and this might be coming up later, but we don't see the procurement policy on the calendar. And I know that the procurement is someone about to say something?
Commissioner, it's for June 15, 2021. It's the last box in the bottom right corner.
So why was that taken off of the calendar for this past year?
Yeah, currently on last year's calendar, it was set for October 9th of 2019. Prior to that, we originally saw it in the spring of 19, and it was postponed then again.
So I'm curious to actually see Dr. James, since it has been postponed several times, why has it been postponed? And then what has the progress been up until this point? Because if it was on the calendar previously, I'm sure that there has been some work with that policy. I'm just curious to know where we are with it. And if it is on this on FY21, why is it so late, right? Why is it in June and not somewhere closer? I get the COVID crisis and all of that, but the postponement from the fall came before the COVID crisis started to happen. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so I could speak a little bit to the history of that. So initially, there were the biggest changes, honestly, in the procurement policy that we initially saw were in the regulation, and those were changed. Commissioner James Hassan had a lot of ideas as far as how we could do wholesale changes into the procurement policy. So I believe we had a procurement public forum that really wasn't well attended. So we really want to make more of a public effort this year to get more feedback on the feedback that you all provided during that process. Additionally speaking, we have a brand new CFO. So, that also weighs into the policy configuration matrix with, having to balance the budget, having to create the budget and kind of going through a new fiscal year. So we could definitely take a look at moving it up earlier, but just the way that the calendar fell and the way that we want to do engagement throughout the, with the community, some real engagement about how we could better our procurement processes. There was a big difference between our school of thought, what needed to be changed, and the feedback we got, which was great feedback. So we definitely needed to do more research, and it was a much bigger lift than we initially intended. So that was kind of why it was postponed in the first place, and why we're giving ourselves a good amount of time moving forward to make those changes for this upcoming year.
Great. So you're saying that the bulk of the edits have been in the regulations and not the actual policy.
Yeah, that was correct. And then, Commissioner James Hassan had a lot of ideas about procurement and the way and it was initially brought to us to be added to the calendar as something where, there just needed to be small regulatory changes. But then as we were digging into it, the committee and the board had a lot of ideas to how to really change the policy. So that it basically was like an onion where we just kept, taking off layers and revealing that, more people had more and more ideas on how we could just completely change the process. So that made it more of a lift than what it was initially intended, which in turn delayed the progress of it.
I see. And this is just a suggestion that I'll interject because I don't want to hold the discussion up. But I think that when we are considering input from our community and all stakeholders around policy when we're doing forums on them, my recommendation would be to take them outside of 200 East North Avenue and kind of do some engagement within various communities throughout our school system to get different input. Input that we probably would not necessarily get from people coming to headquarters to do that. And it also gives us an opportunity to to be more engaged in the communities that we all serve. So that is just a recommendation that I have when we're thinking about policy engagement. The boardroom is nice, but it would be nice to find other ways to get outside of the boardroom to perhaps create more welcoming or inviting environments for that dialogue and feedback that we authentically need to shape policy for our school system.
Thank you.
If I might jump in, Commissioner McFadden, what I also would ask Joe that we think about, especially with procurement, because it was originally in spring 19, then fall 19, and now not till spring of 21, is to get an update on where the process is or how we are engaging with the community, maybe during like the September meeting. So to front load, since it is a heavy lift, and pushing it off till June, but if we could hear an update on where you are and how we could support your work, it's like the August or September meeting.
So I definitely agree with the update aspect. I have a little bit of a disagreement with the September timeline, just because I think we're going to be in a virtual space until then. So I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to do. And that's another reason why this was posed to the end, because we want to do a lot of community engagement. So I think maybe an update in December or maybe November might be a little bit better suited once, God willing, we get back into the schools and we're able to go out to community spaces as requested by Commissioner McFadden. I just think September might be a little too soon. I don't necessarily know if we're going to have that much to update you on in September.
I hear that and I appreciate it. What I would be looking for in the update is how you're planning on reaching out to people. And the other half, and this is gentle and certainly doesn't have to mean we have to stick with September as an earlier idea, but this is a real opportunity to figure out how we leverage technology better and differently for whether we're remote or face-to-face. So there may be some mindful approaches that we could hear about earlier. If we wait till December to hear about what the plan is, then that gives, again, a relatively small time window to say, okay, our plan to get community engagement is from January to March to do this. Well, then by the time, will you be ready for a first reader in June? Or do we need to use the plan to help move the needle to be ready when we open back up?
Gotcha. I misunderstood the ask. That makes sense. So we'll plan on something for September.
Does that meet your needs, Commissioner McFadden, as well?
That's fine. One final thing. Thank you, Christian, for sending what hasn't been converted. I think what could be helpful too is to add to this what Joe was referring to in that cross reference. So perhaps what policies are relative to the board rules that have not been converted yet, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like if LCA is replacing a board rule, just add that information to this sheet for the board to review.
I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
So, and I'll bounce back to Commissioner Brooks in just a moment. It's hard without cameras to see who wants to get in. But I would think the same situation may come up, and I noticed that Commissioner Hayek Hubbard is on with us, and so this may be for her. I also want to give an acknowledgement to Rachel Duncan from PCAB, who's taken her time out of her day to be here as well. We appreciate PCAB and your participation. But this policy KCA hasn't been put off as long as procurement, but certainly has been rescheduled several times. So looking at it now being rescheduled for November, just if we could hear, is that a capacity issue? Is that, again, about community engagement? Just some idea of why it doesn't show up sooner in our calendar as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Hassan. The reason why it was put off, frankly, is because of the COVID closure. Right now, we were supposed to be doing all of the community engagement around that particular policy, right? Going out to the community since March, it's supposed to start in March and go through now to come forward. We are trying to figure out a new way of designing all of the community engagement work we're doing. And so just giving us space to figure out what our plans are for how we're doing a new remote version of community engagement and family engagement. We wanted to make sure we had that figured out. and then start that process when school got back in session, so around August or September, to make sure that we had family engagement, right, during that time period. We can come back in November. That's the reason for it, because we didn't want to do it over the summer months when we're also engaging families around distance learning, what their experience was over the COVID closure. Like, we don't want to mix those conversations between that and what the family engagement overall as a district should be versus our response during the recovery period. So that's why it is November. And I really do hold strongly to that, because we are going to be upholding so many focus groups. We're going to be upholding virtual listening tours, right? Support groups, et cetera, over the summer. And that's going to take up the majority of time for our engagement. We didn't want to mix the two. That's helpful.
Right. And actually that's, so it's sort of the opposite of the procurement policy, wondering if you don't actually need more time. Like, we realistically don't need to look towards February or March, just because of the nature of the policy.
Well, we do feel like there's an urgency because it hasn't been updated in several years. So we want to try to stick to that. But I will go back to the team and make sure November, I mean, you know, everybody's trying to please everybody, right? And when a chief says, let's figure this out, they're trying to get it as done as quickly as possible. I will go back and ask the team if they feel like a month or two would give them more flexibility. I will just say, and I see Rachel on here as well, we've just been trying to re-establish a relationship with PCAB as well, and having them help us do some of this outreach and sort of getting really in tune with what they want to do for outreach and what we want to do for outreach. So yes, I will go back and talk to them, and I'll recommend, but right now we'll stick with November unless they say otherwise.
Okay. Yeah, because I would love to, having, you know, sort of stewarded this calendar for a bit now, when we have to cancel something, then it leaves us, you know, with a meeting that's a 10-minute meeting, and
yeah.
And it's very different for the public aspect to understand also the staff requirements behind it. So rather than move it from November to February last minute, I would rather more mindfully go in and say, no, we're gonna do this in February so that we can have something on the agenda in November, rather than needing to cancel if there's something that's more sort of perfunctory.
Yep.
But if you think November's great, November's great.
I'm about to put you on dark and call my staff now, and I'll come back and let you know what they say.
I think that's like, talk about responsiveness. That's some community engagement.
I mean, Rachel, do you have a thought about that as well as the PCAB policy person? Do you want to weigh in on the timing of that? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Nothing much additional. I mean, I do think it will take some time to get that engagement, but November might be enough time. You know, we're still sorting out on the PCAB side over the summer, our recruitment and other things to get us in position to support with that. But I would think by the start of the school year, we'd be ready to go.
Can we, what is later in the month? I mean, of course, we'd have to shift something else. So, I mean, that's the one thing we want to look at too, is what else we would have to shift, and we should have, you know, engagement on most policies. There should be engagement, and part of the whole plan of this lighter schedule is to provide more time to engage more in a more meaningful way with our communities. So I just want to make sure we don't push this one off and then we then compromise the ability to engage on another policy.
Yeah. Joe, do you have a thought
I think
about
Kristen
that?
is.
Sorry,
I think Kristen right now is going through and working on sort of looking at just a general, which policies really need larger pushed out neighborhood community level conversations, which policies need more electronic feedback engagement, which policies really are more like conversions or legislative adaptations that really just need a perfunctory stamp, so that we don't overtax our need for community engagement, but that we're really being authentic on and which policies need community input before they ever come to a reader, rather than a wordsmithing, so that we can look at not approaching all policies the exact same way, because all policies don't require the same kind of input, so that we also keep our community responsive. So Rachel, were you going to add in?
No, I'm good.
Okay, perfect. All right, Tina, are you good? Is there anybody else you want to say? Okay. One of the things that I talked with the committee about as we look at the calendar and looking at what's on the calendar, as well as what we might envision to either add to this year's calendar or tee up to calendars in future years to help make policies transformative. And so I just want to do a quick quip and allow each of the commissioners to jump in with just sort of an open brainstorm. Here's some spaces we see in policy needs. some spaces we might want to think about leaning into policy as we move forward. And certainly this is not a prescriptive, nobody, Joe, we're not looking at you saying these have to go on the calendar this year. But in order for the board to truly be the transformational leaders that we want to be, if we only think about what's immediately in front of us, we might not be getting to what needs to be on the calendar in the 21-22, 22-23 school year. So I'll open it up to either Commissioner McFadden or Commissioner Brooks for if you have other ideas for policies or changes, removals of policies, anything that you think we should consider for this year's calendar and or future calendars.
Yeah, so I have one other question that came back to me.
Sure, absolutely, go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Particularly for Joe, specifically, you mentioned that there was going to be a committee that comes together to meet to kind of sort of crosswalk the current policies, but then also to see where there are redundancies and so forth, so that we don't necessarily create new things in those places. One, so who makes up that committee? And then two, are the policy committee members invited to participate in those meetings? And if not, how do we get to be involved in those prior sessions?
That's a great question. I'm going to defer here to Chief Legal Officer Josh Sivan, because he is the leader of this work. So I'm going to defer to him for any comment on that.
Sure. We had just talked about it internally among staff, so we are coordinated among staff about the intersections with policies, so that they then could be brought to the committee as a whole, to the extent to which we were making changes. But my thought was consistent from prior work and also discussions here, is that there's important work. I think Joe referenced it and other referenced it. Now that we have converted a lot of board rules to policies, there may well be overlap and engagement, so that allowing us to take a deep dive and then surface that up to the members of the policy committee for key decisions, just like we did as a preview later to the chart we did about policies and regulations potentially impacted by COVID-19, so that the committee had the background and knowledge necessary to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. But so my question was, who sits on that committee? And then two, can we be invited to those meetings?
So we had envisioned being cross-functional among the various offices in the school system. And, I think we should work it out. We have the Open Meetings Act to consider, but we should work out what's appropriate to keep the board informed about our work.
Yeah, so is there a reason why one commissioners could not sit in on the work session that you all have going on?
I mean, I think typically in a situation like this, we would do the work to tee up key decisions for the board and then bring it to the board, who then would oversee and give us guidance, not necessarily participate in the work.
Right. So is that, I'm assuming that's for what? So essentially, if I want to know in real time what's going on, is there anything that would preclude me from sitting in and listening as you all work a policy or do some generative thinking about sort of what you might want to tee up?
I mean, I think it's just the general separation between board roles and responsibilities and then staff roles to actually, do the work and then tee up decisions for the board giving guidance and policy, and then staff kind of thinking through how to implement that. So it's just trying to create separation in there to create, consistency in terms of roles and responsibilities.
Yeah.
Dr. Brooks, though, just if I might, for historical purposes, we do have precedent, however, of board members sitting on staff committees. I, for one, sat on the 1 year plus committee for 3 years, and we have other board members who have in the past, so it wouldn't preclude it from happening. It's just not typically the way we have handled things for the last 3 years or so.
Okay, so that's helpful for me, because I think I have an interest in seeing the work that goes in, not that I have to sort of weigh in those spaces, but I would love to be able to know what's happening in real time. As I sort of better understand sort of the policy landscape, and the thinking that goes into it. And so by the time it comes to us, I have a better sense of what we're going to be talking about. And then, just so that I can see that, I think that would be really meaningful to me. But then also particularly around that, I know that, thank you, Martha, for Commissioner James Hassan for putting it out there, because I know that commissioners do actually engage in specific staff-related activities, including the hiring of particular staff members. So there is a way in which our board functionality does not preclude us from engaging with staff and sitting on staff-related content areas. So I just kind of wanted to just see that it's more of a this is how we do things versus sort of this is the policy that actually says that you can't.
It is much more habitus than policy.
Okay.
And some of it is habitus because it's best practices in many cases to stay out, to ensure that we stay in governance. But there are many incidents we could all list of our own personal engagement. Like I said, whether it's mine on the 1 Year Plus committee or my engagement with the Arts Grant Planning Initiative, or commissioners, as you said, who have been part of hiring committees or consultants, at least on hiring. So yeah, there are ways.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we always try to think about ways to engage the board. So let us think about it and think about what makes sense. We're always trying to figure out the ways to engage the board in a way that also doesn't, again, really blur the lines. I mean, what is a constructive way to include the board in the decision making along the way? So let us think about it a little bit. And I think this is a topic of conversation also at the board business meeting.
Exactly. So the board can then figure out how we want to engage, and we can have a mutual conversation there.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. And to Commissioner James Hassan, so to your question around sort of new things that we might want to be considering or pulling off or sort of adding, one of the things, and Christian, thank you so much for sending over the documents, that I saw that we have a health policy that needs to still be moved from, I believe it needs to come from, let me make sure I'm actually saying the right thing. It looks like it is, what is this number? I should have wrote down the exact, but it's the health one.
The wellness policy?
Section 510. And it says, these are the ones that have not been converted to board policy as of 3/26/2020. And I'm wondering if this particular one might need to sort of show up sooner, given that section seems like that would be the section where the updates specific to LGBT health and gender identity that was recently passed by MSDE would need to be incorporated into that.
Can you remind us what those call letters are for my notes? I couldn't read.
Yeah, so let me just, it is, so this is in the document that Christian sent, board rules not converted on board policy 3/26/2020, that's the date. And it is health protocols, Article 5, Section 510. And so it lists 510.1 is general, 510.02 is viral illness, asthma, HIV, blood and exposure, required health screenings, protective eye devices. So it sounds like it could be specific to just kind of like virology, or is this going to be the space where we update the mandates from MSDE specific to LGBT and gender inclusivity?
Or both.
Or both, yeah.
Without digging into it, it sounds like it might be. Joe or Christian, do you have a thought on that? Or Josh? On that one needing to be expedited or moved up and added to the calendar? Allison,
we could consider adding it when we talk about JBB.
Mm-hmm.
That was my thought as well.
Yeah, and to that point, Josh, one of the things that I think might be really helpful is to do an actual visual analytics of the policy interaction. So, I envision JBB being this big dot with these rays that it also connects to community engagement, it connects to employee leave, and the grading policy would have spikes that connect to athletic eligibility and screening for high school admission, and so that we get a real template of what are our big ball policies, just in a visualization, and what are the kinds of connections, so that we can see, if we have a policy that's not connected to anything, that one might need to go. If we have a policy like all the dots are this size except for one is this size, let's hope that's our equity policy. So that we can really look at the effectiveness and the interaction of crosswalking policies through a visually analytic approach to be able to see where our holes are, our redundancies, as well as the impact. So like if community school shows up to be this little itty bitty policy, then we're not doing enough to connect it to other areas. Does that make sense?
Yes, and related to that is the ways in which I think, whether it was Christian or Joe, or you may have mentioned that ways where we can streamline, so that thinking about the end user as our parents and our students and our stakeholders don't have to know that there are 5 related policies, but are there options to fold them down to 3, and maybe there aren't, but just so that analysis at least is an analysis that we do.
And that's one of the things that I would, when we get around to my proposal for the calendar, thinking about this committee, establishing a very short-term task force to get some input on how better to disseminate policy information, to get to teachers, paraprofessionals, and principals without this sort of game of telephone that it gets lost if it's not directly impacting someone. And then people only know about it when there's a violation, rather than the policy setting the course of excellence and being a leader to transforming the district, instead of where it sort of feels like it is now with it's a gotcha, oh, you didn't adhere to this policy. And then the conversation was, I didn't know there was a policy. So that's one of the things that I hope this committee can take on next year is working to figure out how to push out that information more efficiently. This year we developed an infographic. Thank you, Christian, for your support on that, to help people understand the policy process, but not even sure how far that got out into people's hands so they have that information. Anything else, Darrell, that you'd like to throw in? And we can always circle back to you as well if you want.
Oh, can you hear? I'm sorry, I was on mute. The one of the other things that kind of stood out to me, and particularly around the list that was laid out of around the COVID-19 impacts on policy, just in terms of thinking about sort of, it was ranked on medium, high, low risk, or in terms of immediacy, I'm assuming. The policy that was around sort of patriotic exercises was listed as a medium. I was really wondering if that really needed to be there. If that could be, if we're thinking about lowering the load on folks, that could be just dropped down so that it's not felt like someone has to have energy to kind of work on that at that particular moment.
And that's on the list of policies that we may get to later in more depth. And I think that we wanted to flag that largely because as we potentially continue to exist in some degree of virtual learning, how do we think strategically about what is actually a state law requirement to say the pledge at the beginning of every day, and how do we work through that in a virtual space, potentially even interacting with our state elected and appointed officials about the challenges that creates for our teachers and our students.
Yeah, and I'm envisioning we'll get into that more when we get to that segment also on the agenda. We're really digging into that, unless Joe or Christian, your thought was having this as all one conversation.
No, I thought it was separate. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep that question in mind when we move to that section, because I think there may be some other on that as well. Commissioner McFadden.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I remembered a poll that I did with via social media and with some teacher groups that I have been a part of within the city and throughout the community. And there were a couple of things that came out with policy ideas. A few of them were relative to our JKA policy, which already exists, that deals with student discipline and things of that nature. So I'm glad that we've been looking at that policy. But I'm also looking at some of the comments and the feedback. Will the school family councils be incorporated in the family, what is this, in KCA? Will the school family council structure, the need for every school to have school family councils, the input from the community, the parents, and all of that, the makeup of the council, will that be a part of KCA?
Yes, sir, it will be. Thank you for the question. We are definitely adding that. We're also, just as a side note, trying to do a revamp of the school family council this year, making them stronger, supporting the schools. So there's also work that's going to be happening before the policy creation happens. But yes, it will be a part of KCA.
I appreciate you, Chief. You know I do. But also, because there are so many school family councils that don't exist, there are some school family councils that exist. It's like there's no consistency really throughout our system in our district with what they look like. So I'm glad to know that that is being queued up for KCA. So I appreciate that. Another thing that came up was the entrance criteria schools. Do we already have a policy around criteria entrance? The duplication of programming or the expansion of our portfolio, requirements for students, and the actual criteria for entrance. Do we have anything that currently speaks to that? And is that something that we could potentially consider policy development focusing on?
So I believe we do, and I believe I voted on it when I was a commissioner, because haven't seen it recently. So let's be honest about I don't know the full breadth of it, but I will say this: we are working right now on managing what it's going to look like to remove the entrance criteria to several of our CTE programs as required by the state, which will take place in this fall choice round, so that in November, December, those schools will now be offered as lottery options for all of our students versus a score criteria option. We are also, as part of reimagining our ECT work and in general, looking to look at our whole choice process in our program and make it a more equitable process. But I can't reference particularly which policy it is. Jeremy, you can help me with that. But we need to think about, is there a policy revision that needs to be done? That's part of the work we're going to be doing. I just can't speak to it yet because I haven't looked at the policy to know whether or not to do change, or we can edit and do the work we need to do within the existing policy.
Right, probably in the regs.
Yeah.
Sure. If that, no, I'm looking at it. It looks like it is policy JFBA. The school choice process and criteria and entrance criteria, and the regs are there. So I'm going to go back through that. Thank you for that, Chief Icover. And then finally, where are we with policy GCO? We've received a lot of feedback from community stakeholders, from several of our union partners, particularly with the teachers union, as it relates to evaluations, observations. Are we moving forward with the implementation of GCO? Are we having some time to collaborate, to do some engagement around what it could potentially look like? Are we pushing pause because we're now in a virtual space? Where are we with GCO? I'm curious to know.
So we did release the updated instructional framework in our communications to the school community yesterday. We still are looking at what it means, what implementation looks like this year in terms of what the training would look like, what are the requirements about how we implement it. So we are still in conversation about that. We actually had a meeting today about it, about what it looks like. I think we're somewhat waiting to see what the year looks like as we make those decisions, and we'll come back to you with how we adjust the plan based on the environment next year.
I appreciate that, Chief Perkins Cohen. Allison, I appreciate it. But I do think that we have to be responsive to the folks that are providing that input. I would be nervous to go into a virtual, remote, whatever the combination may or may not look like, and for us to not, and for all of what went into that policy development, and the relevance and just that entire process, I would hate for it to, I would hate for the intent to not be upheld in the way that it should be. So if there are barriers that are in place, if there are all of these unknowns, I think that this really does need attention. I would be nervous to go into an instructional year with a, an evaluative policy and process with all of these unknown factors. So yes, I would like to hear more about that as we are in that process and as we're moving and developing. But I am not leaning toward the side, right? Maybe we need to adjust the regulations in the interim. I'm not sure what we need to do, but I'm not leaning toward the side right now of moving forward with that with so many unknowns. And that is from my perspective. So I just want to put that out there as we're all working through, this crisis and moving forward with teaching and learning.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm just texting with Chief Grant Skinner. I know he's in union negotiations or a union meeting, I think, a meeting with union leadership. So I agree with you. We have the same sense of urgency about we need to make a decision on this. So we will come back to the board with our update on that.
I appreciate it, Chief. Thanks.
Mr. James, you're muted.
You're muted, Martha.
How about now? I appreciate what Commissioner Cadden teeing up not only the policy, but also some of the challenges so that staff can work ahead knowing like this is where he's thinking on this. So thank you very much for that. Commissioner Brooks, did you want to jump back in? Are you good? I make sure that as thoughts pop in, there's space for them.
Yeah, so I think as we continue to do this work around me trying to sort of bring out some more transparency around the needs of LGBTQ students and staff in this within the district, I'm consistently sort of reminded of the possibility of having a specific policy that ensures that we have someone, a staff person, or some sort of coordinated structure that would sort of capture the responses and the needs of our LGBT students and staff in order to make sure that we're structuring and creating an environment for their academic and professional success. And so I know that we had some policy around really trying to make sure that our trans students and gender identity and expression are protected, but then specifically around like, okay, so now that we have it, where does it live? And so how do we sort of create a policy to ensure that this work lives somewhere and that it can be followed up with?
Great, thank you. And that's what I mean about trying to use policy to be transformational, is saying, what are the bare minimums that we need to have happen in order to do this? And just even hearing that, it never occurred to me that we didn't already.
Josh?
Martha, you're frozen. I can't hear you.
I'm going to turn my camera off and see if that doesn't speed up my internet. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. And so I'll go dark and see if that doesn't help. Anyway, all I was saying was that I was shocked that we didn't have someone like that. So that's how we can use policy to be more transformational.
And just following up on that point, and sorry to interject,
no, go ahead.
But my office, our equal opportunity portion of my office, and Tracy Durant's equity office are working together to both update the board and the community about our work to implement and to address those various very important questions about support for our LGBTQ students, and looking at models from across the country and locally to do that work. So we hope to provide further updates to the board as part of my onboarding and engagement with that work in part that sits under me.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Thank you for that, Josh. And I think one of the things that I want us to be really clear about is that sort of as a board of commissioners, our responsibility is not just to our students, but to our staff. And so it's really important that our staff also have a place to report experiences. I know that firsthand that there are teachers in this district who have experienced bullying and harassment, not only from students because of their gender and sexual identity, but also from other staff members. And so I want us to be inclusive of them as well. I don't want to leave them out.
Great. And there are some places in the staff policies that begin to address that, but certainly I think we want to lean into your expertise to make sure that they're as robust as they need to be and as accurate.
And I do want to say on the calendar for the upcoming year, we do have ACB, sexual harassment, which is kind of the staff equivalent of JBB, which was the student one. So these are definitely things that we could address in that policy review.
Yeah, and so this is one of the areas where I see that sort of the conflation of the two don't necessarily serve us, right? And so to talk about sexual identity and sort of safety in terms of one's gender identity and expression and sort of sexual harassment, I know that's how it was lumped together. That makes it was, I think it was done particularly with a strategic purpose in mind, but that they are actually two fundamentally different things, and that so that we have to figure out how to support and create space for LGBT folks, and that bullying and harassment is something that is different, and sort of sex-based harassment and so forth. So that's not one that I would want to have like lumped together.
Right, there's support and creating a positive culture, and then there's reporting incidents of bullying and harassment, two different things, although they can intersect.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Yep, and historically, Terrell, just so that you know, that came up when this policy was first presented, that looking at protecting from harassment was different than creating and cultivating positive work environments, recruiting, retaining, acknowledging and validating. We passed it knowing it was an imperfect policy because something was better than nothing at that point, but we knew it was going to come back to the policy committee within 2 years when we had more information and were able to make a decision that was going to be less likely to have unintended negative consequences.
Thank you for that context.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of my ideas around the calendar, then I'll whip it back just because I can't see your faces, Ronald and Jarrell, and then we'll move on to the next item. So a couple things that I'm interested in seeing on the calendar, either this year or in the future. One, I just want to remind people that around procurement, certainly one of the asks was that we consider how we leverage our $1.2 billion budget to make a community impact beyond the need of the initial expenditure. So looking at if we're contracting with a company for, $1.6 million, how are they helping us support academics? How are they helping us support internships and CTE placements? And what can we do to institutionalize that understanding that we are in a light P3 partnership with everyone with whom we contract? And how can we take more advantage of the expertise, resources, and skills and ability of those with whom we contract? The other part of the procurement policy is looking at how we do, and I just lost the word, requirement contracts, and how we're ensuring that we are in fact cycling through the approved providers. So for those who may not know, and I believe requirements contract is the right word, when we procure 10 vendors to be able to provide copier services, within our policy, it says we're going to use vendor A one time and then go to vendor B next and vendor C. And we go all the way through all 10 vendors before we go back to vendor A again. So in our current process, we have no way of the board hearing that that's in fact how we're doing this once we approve a contract to multiple vendors. So those are two big things that I hope are in the procurement contract or policy, whether it stays in June, in which case I may no longer be here, or the rest of the board is supporting it, or it comes earlier. Some other sort of ways of looking at aspirational policies. One is trying to look at how we can use policy to be proactive rather than when we're in the middle of crisis trying to change, fix the plane as we're flying it. We right now have no need necessarily to redistrict. We have no urgency around redistricting. We're going to now be building new high schools and fixing new high schools. So chances of needing to look at how we district, even within the choice system, may be necessary, and considering a policy for the process for redistricting. And I'm thinking a very clear timeline, like 9 months before we consider a redistricting plan, we assemble a multi-stakeholder task force to discuss best plans and look at the data of need. And then 8 months before we do, this is the next step, and 6 months before we go out to redistrict, and including in that elected officials that represent various areas of the city, developers, community activists and advocates, stakeholders from special ed, from gifted and talented, so that we have a really, really robust piece so that when a superintendent comes in, because we know when superintendents first come in, taking on redistricting can be at the end of a job. So we won't get a new superintendent that is interested in redistricting. And a superintendent doesn't want to necessarily leave in a legacy of chaos. So how can we create a culture of calm, a culture of trust around some of these big lever processes we may need to do, such as redistricting through policy in advance. So again, that doesn't need to go on this year's calendar necessarily, but I think certainly should be something the policy committee has queued in their brains to be prepared for in the future. I would offer again, as I did last year, that we don't have a policy that says that we plan to adhere to, or that we commit to adhering to COMAR academic requirements. We have many policies that say we're going to adhere to state law, or that we're going to adhere to other aspects of the functioning and operations of schools that are determined by COMAR. But as far as the academic offerings, we don't have. And you'll see in the policy conversation later about COVID, if we had that policy in place, it might make reentry plans easier and clearer for people, because we would know that we can't cut specific areas within the content and moving forward. Again, not something that has to be on this calendar. Last year when I asked for it to be on this calendar, we decided that it wasn't the right time yet. So we did put in metrics in the CEO's evaluation to move towards that target, with the understanding that hopefully that will become policy sometime in the near future. And then the board at our business meeting is we talk about communication within internal with the board, internal with staff, and then external with stakeholders. And so I'm not sure if that needs to elevate to the level of policy, or if we need to just create some really consistent practices and publish them to the community, so the community is well versed and knows what's going on there. So those are my big ones, and some of those coming from conversations with policy committee members. So with that, I'll swing through the policy committee members one more time, and then if there's any thoughts from Josh, Joe, or Christian or Allison, and then we can move on in the agenda. So Ronald, anything? I am
I'm thinking about this idea of redistricting, and what that would mean for us, given our system. Generally, our high schools are not necessarily district. But Allison, I'm curious to know, how does that relate to the comprehensive educational facilities master plan, if it relates at all, when we think of zones and districting? And then I also think, Dr. James, it's important to have a little bit more clarity around what you mean as it relates to redistricting. So I think it's two things. Allison, I kind of want to know a little bit more about that comprehensive master plan and how it relates to it. But then to Dr. James, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on your intent for your ask.
Sure. So let me go first. I'm offering it as a metaphor. Like, this is the kind of policy that we might now look at making. So policies that we're not immediately dealing with a crisis over, but policies that we could have in place to provide a smoother operation as we move forward. So I'm only using redistricting as an example.
Okay, I see.
Of something we're not in the middle of, but that districts often encounter, and having a process for it in advance, making it easier. Does that make sense, Commissioner McFadden?
I understand, yes.
Okay, so yes, we could talk about it as a specific, and I'll turn it over to Allison to share input on that. But really, I was looking at what are the things that we might have that we're going to have to deal with that are systemic and operational in the next 3 to 10 years, and how can we begin setting a policy foundation that increases public trust and increases public investment and confidence in us to make those decisions, rather than getting mixed messages as we set policy while we're in the middle of it.
Sure, I
Allison,
see.
thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is a good metaphor, because you're right, it is one that requires some stability to really engage in a process like that. And so I think it is a good example. We have done work to think about redistricting, it's a challenge to think about how to do it to fit it into our context, as the landscape changes pretty regularly. The CEFMP, is a process where we're regularly looking at our enrollment trends and then trying to make decisions. As you know, we go through an annual portfolio review process where the team really does a comprehensive look at the kinds of programs that we have across the city, the enrollment trends, and tries to make sure we're still providing a range of good options across the city. That is kind of a constantly changing landscape, and so we are, continuing to assess whether that requires us to do some, serious redistricting in order to achieve the goal. It is, frankly, part of the conversation that's hard is that I think there's always an interest in making sure, like in Dr. Pfeiffer's work that she's doing with the CTE, we know that we know from that study that the offerings that we have across the district
Right.
are not meeting students' needs the way they should. So, we need to improve those offerings and try to figure out how to really make sure that those offerings are providing education that prepares students for a living wage. And we want to make sure that's offered across the city. So we are really prioritizing that kind of work right now, and that's why Chief Hubbard talked about the entrance criteria for those schools to make sure that those are there are a range of good options there that students can have access to. I think, in past times we've talked about, are you trying to make sure that in each quadrant of the city there's a range of options that every student can have access to, that gives them a good range of options. Challenge with that is really having the resources to make that possible. And so I think it's a constant review we're trying to do about how do you most effectively utilize resources to make sure opportunities are good quality for students. What are the opportunities we should be making available for students, and how does the choice process or entrance criteria decision making, or how does a redistricting process fit into that? And I think that we do a kind of more regular review of to have an annual review where we're really looking at our portfolio of schools. That's happening kind of more often than it does for most districts, and because we're a choice district. But I think there's a lot of components to it that require constant thought about which lever we're pulling to try to create better equity for students. So also under Chief Hubbard's world, we're also thinking about how do you improve the choice process to make sure students have better access to students. So I think that's not a very straightforward answer, except to say that all of these pieces are really complex in Baltimore because of transportation,
Right,
because of
that's what I was going to mention, the our transportation situation that we have here.
our transportation situation, the research we did on the CTE offerings, the research we've done on the enrollment choice and transfer. And so it's kind of considering all those factors to figure out of the various ways that we could make decisions that would improve the accessibility at high quality options for students, which are the ones that we really want to invest in. So we are really investing in the CTE right now. We are doing real work to make sure that we are improving the offerings for students right now in that. Tina is doing real work on the choice to really improve the choice process to make sure that is better serving students. And then another one that's out there that we're always thinking about but haven't quite moved on yet is the landscape. And we had moved on the entrance criteria for CTE. That was that was one big step. But then there's also the entrance criteria in general, the choice landscape. The redistricting landscape. Those are all interrelated, and and so we're just kind of prioritizing which ones we move at which time. I'm sorry that's not a very direct answer. It's just that.
You put it in the right context, so I appreciate what you just offered. It was really just my thoughts in response to what Dr. James was mentioning. So thank you. It's a lot to synthesize, so I appreciate you attempting to do it. So. And it's a lot for me to synthesize personally. So
I appreciate the fact that you are referring to CFMP because I think it does a really good job of thinking about all those different pieces. But then, like I said, there's only so many things you can take on at one time. So strategically, what are the things that we're moving first that we think will have the biggest impact on students first? So we have prioritized the CTE work, we've prioritized enrollment work. And so the other things are still in there, and we always prioritize portfolio. And so the other pieces are in there. It's just a matter of kind of when do we braid those into all the other strategies we're trying to put in place to make sure that all of our students have access to the options that are worthy of them.
Sure.
Excellent. Anything else, Commissioner Saad? Okay, Dr. Brooks. And then once you finish, if you have anything, we'll go on to JJIC, the regulation.
Yeah, so I just wanted to toss out there, and particularly because I'm not sure, and Christian, maybe you can help me, specifically around, approaching my 1 year on the board. There have been times where I felt information has been withheld, or processes that we've engaged in as a district, particularly when it comes to commissioners, have not always been transparent or helpful. And also sometimes it's felt uneven in terms of who gets access or asked to do things from the district management side versus some of us on the commissioner side. So I'm wondering if Christian and Dr. Hassan and Ronald and other folks on the phone, are there policies in which we need to be sort of engaging or reinterrogating to see how do we ensure that there's a transparent and a systematic process that is equally distributed, so that we don't have to wonder why some commissioners are able to participate in sort of hiring and decision making on that side, or consulting, or whatever you want to call it, versus some of the other ones who are not. And so I wonder, is there a place for how we engage one another that might be strengthened with policy?
Commissioner Brooks, I can just add to that piece. In the B series right now, there are, and I've sent this document to you with the board leadership responsibilities. There are some touches on that point of who gets which committee membership, and who gets assigned what. So I would just say, suggest taking a look at those, and if there are some suggestions you think of, you could possibly add to that or amend in the upcoming year. Perhaps we could add that into the calendar.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Christian. And so what I'm talking more specific about, sort of the ways in which, not just how the board process, like our process around how things are selected, but I'm talking about engagement with the district, and particularly on the administrative side or the management side. And so there are ways in which I'm wondering, are there policies that need to be considered or reevaluated to suggest that how we do business together, how we relate into one another, sort of is codified, so there isn't a unevenness between sort of who gets access to particular types of information versus others. And so that's my question. The big question is, how do we begin to sort of, one, is there something that I just am not aware of? And then two, if not, do we need to have a policy created or generated to ensure that there's some equity in that space?
Okay, if I may answer your question directly, the only thing I can think of is we do have a communication protocol between the board and the CEO, the CEO's office, but to my knowledge, there isn't a broader policy of kind of information sharing and access between the board and staff.
Great, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Hassan,
Alrighty.
Ronald, do y'all have a sense of sort of thoughts around that?
Around our communication with staff?
Yeah, or is there something that I'm missing in terms of context or policy?
No, there's not a policy, and we've certainly talked about it a little bit. But I agree with you that there is a definite differential on who is welcome to engage and how they should engage and when they engage. That might be a barrier to trust and communication within the board. So I think that'll be a good conversation at our business meeting.
Great.
Okay. All right. I wish I could see everybody, so it's so hard to read commissioners. If you want something else, just let me know. Otherwise, we'll move on to policy JJIC, the regulation conversation. No?
Mr. James, I had one point to add.
Go ahead.
This is Christian. So I developed a draft of the tiers that you requested. So we'll be able, with Joe's consultation, so we'll be able to discuss that at the annual business meeting. And we will also have a suggested tiers for the policy calendar for the annual business meeting.
Fabulous. So I'm guessing we get to hear from my favorite Miss Bird at this point, maybe?
Chief, I'm sorry, Chair James. Chief High Cover put in the chat about KCA. And she said she spoke with the team. I'm not sure if you can see it. I'm just reading it. She spoke with the team and they would appreciate the consideration of moving the KCA policy review until February if it fits appropriately with the other calendar items. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that.
I did see that, and I saw Joe, as soon as it popped up, Joe nodded his head a little bit, so I assumed that nonverbal meant that he was going to look and see what it fit in the calendar. Was that a correct interpretation of your nod?
That's right. Yeah, I'll work with Chief High Cupboard and her team to see, if we can move it and what moving it means and all that stuff. So I'll send an updated version of the calendar if it needs to be updated. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. And just to really clarify for the community, this is not us wanting to push off the policy. This is us wanting to make sure that the policy is as robust and comprehensive as it can be, with as much community input going into it, as well as that we're being realistic on the timeline, so we don't have to arbitrarily bump it and then not be able to be efficient with the rest of our policy time. So just understand, community, we are definitely invested in doing this well, doing this right, and as expediently as possible. All right. So JJIC, Tiffany, is that you?
Yes, I am here, but Mr. Torrance is going to start with our lead-in, and then I will discuss the content.
Okay, I was just super excited to see you because we haven't seen you in this virtual format yet.
And until my camera's repaired, you can't, but I'm here.
You just have on sweatpants. All right, so Ms. Torres, is that who we're getting?
Yes. Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm James Torrance, staff specialist for strategy and compliance. I'm here with Tiffany Bird. We are bringing forth a revision to Regulation JJICRA, which determines our academic eligibility for intrascholastic and interscholastic sports, which governs both middle school and high school sports. We're bringing this regulation change to provide much needed support for changes that happened to the development of COVID-19, especially since we have a fourth quarter temporary grading policy right now where students will receive a pass or incomplete. That policy right now prevents us from generating a actual GPA for our students. And then when we look further into the definition of 2.0 and the ways that we actually calculate it, the disruption in the fourth quarter then disrupts the 4 consecutive quarters that we have for students to determine a 2.0. And just to give you an understanding of what the standard is a 2.0 and accompanied with a no more than 1 grade below passing. So right now we're in a situation where we want to make sure that we hold students harmless. So this is why we're suggesting the current revision without changing the standards. And I'll swing it over to Ms. Bird, who can give content background, especially from our state partners and where we are in the communications we've had with students and also athletic directors.
Thank you so much, James. That was very, very thorough. Prior to bringing forth this recommendation, we had a focus group meeting with athletic directors. They have had communications with their students, so they were able to give us feedback. And we do understand that there were definitely some issues that the district is already aware of, but we wanted to make sure that that did not impact their participation, provided we even know how we're starting the school year, but we have to be ready and prepared. In addition, we've met with our MPSSA, which is our governing body partners. We've talked to other local jurisdictions, and there are about 50% who have put forth waivers. Many have already been accepted by their boards. Not all school districts have done this, but the reason that many of them have not is they don't all use fourth quarter to determine eligibility. So if a school district uses a year final grade, or some may have elected to go to a third quarter grade, but there are several other local jurisdictions that have put forth the same waiver, which will allow all students to be eligible for that fall period. Even though we understand that there is looming uncertainty around what that will look like or should look like for us, that's another hurdle that we will jump, but this is the one that we are trying to address to make sure that our students aren't negatively impacted by the pass-fail and not being able to use grade point average indicators.
Any questions from my colleagues on the board?
I do. I'm curious. I know that the regulations and I mean the regs can be revised, and I get the process. I'm curious to know, was there any type of engagement perhaps with any of our stakeholders as it relates to this revision? Did we get any input or feedback from anyone outside of our staff to kind of just help wrap our brains around the revision? Or was it just completely administrative and a decision that was made internally?
It was primarily internally, but I would like to acknowledge that when we started this school of thought, at the point that this concern was raised, we had not even finalized the grading policy yet. So it was very, very difficult to determine what direction that we were going in. We did speak to ILEDs, but we did not go externally. And I honestly, that was not a recommendation that was provided to us, but I know when we spoke to athletic directors, I did have them talk to coaches, and they were in contact with some students. And that's how I actually became aware that some had not received technology, that it was being distributed, based on grade levels. So some were working from phones. So that's how I knew that this would be a concern and something that we would need to address, because they were having issues like being removed from the school system. Those are the contacts that we used because they had contact to the students.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Ms. Bird, do you have an idea of how many students might have been adversarially impacted if we had gone with pass-fail from fall grades, or from if we went pass-fail and fail grades weren't exempt?
Well, our issue, the way I understood it, and I believe, James, you can also support the fact that we checked into this, we don't have a failure grade to look at. It's my understanding that it's pass or incomplete.
So, students could have earned an incomplete and still be eligible.
Yes, based on the many number of circumstances or factors why they may have earned that incomplete.
So let me clarify that question, because what I'm hearing in your answer is that it would be an individual decision making. So if students earned an incomplete in the spring, they're still eligible this fall.
Yes.
Or is it based on how come they earned the incomplete?
No, students.
So what I'm saying is somebody might have earned it incomplete because they didn't turn in any work. Somebody might have earned it incomplete because they turned in partial work. Someone might have earned it incomplete because they didn't do a particular signature assignment in a course.
That is correct.
It's
there are various
simply,
reasons, but we would have no way in determining eligibility to identify the variations between why the incomplete was earned.
Okay, and that's what I had hoped. But what I thought I heard you say was that that, you know, depending on the reason for their incomplete, whether they would be eligible or not.
No, I'm just saying that's why we didn't use it as a criteria, because we would not be able to make that determination for eligibility purposes.
Perfect. Okay, that is what I thought. All right. Anything, Commissioner Brooks? So this will come back up again when we talk about the policy changes. And I don't know if we want to start with that as we move on to the policy and regulations impacted by COVID, if we want to start with the athletics policy, or if there's a presentation. So I don't know, is there a presentation on that one, or?
I'd be happy just to frame our work here, if that would be helpful.
Sure, and actually before we switch over, we should give a little note of congratulations to Mr. Torrance on his primary election and his service to our city. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
All right, so yeah,
James will be my my council person. So absolutely, I'd certainly wished him congratulations, but he's very busy getting back to folks right now. And that's not what we're talking about. So I want to leave that off, James, and I'll talk to you about it later.
Yes, and I was going to skip it too, but I'm like, but we're all still people. So, Mr. Coates, you want to tee up the changes for us?
Hi, and I wanted to acknowledge Shahrazad Houghton on my staff, who really did the legwork on this to look through and work with other offices to identify policies and regulations. So we put together a document that became very long, but we wanted to go through, and particularly thanks to the policy committee chair for identifying a number of policies that could potentially be impacted. So we used that and then built on that, going through the whole group of policies and regulations. And Ms. Houghton is now our reigning expert on having read through all of them in one fell swoop. So that will be helpful knowledge going forward. But we looked through the policies and regulations under two criteria. One, the substance, but then at the end also any deadlines in policies that we needed to be attuned to as we were going forward. And we tried to flag language that could potentially be impacted, and some of this was just to make sure we were all aware of it as we're going through these really unprecedented times. And then also having an overlay of what the state may have acted on already and what language in our policies and regulations also overlaps with and intersects with COMAR. So that was an important gloss. And then we tried to prioritize how we work through as policies or regulations that potentially needed to be focused on before the school year started, some of which we've already addressed, policies and regulations that as things become more developed in terms of what our recovering planning may be, we need to focus on. Those were the sort of moderate yellow. So the first category was red, the second category was yellow. And then a third category of low, not to say that there may be some pieces of that we should be attentive to, but given everything that was on our plate, if we didn't get to those this year, it wouldn't be a mission critical challenge. So that was our frame through. It's necessarily preliminary as this is evolving work, and we are interested in other stakeholders' feedback and this committee's feedback. But that I just wanted to frame up as our methodology for going through, and We may have missed things because it was a big job, but we really wanted to tee this up to show that we have been looking through carefully and also to frame the committee's work. One other piece just to frame up is that as we went through, we also considered, and this is related to the conversation about eligibility that we just went through, whether we needed to amend or tweak the policy, the regulation, or both. And just because on the front of moving as quickly as we can, what was the piece of this that had priority, and how to work through it in the most efficient and streamlined fashion. So those are the pieces we could walk through, if that makes sense, or just maybe start with eligibility if that's where the committee wants to go. And I realize it's a lot, so there's a lot to get through here. So if we wanted to just go through, if that would be helpful, and then that could start discussion, we would be welcome to do that.
Sure. And sorry about that. When I only have one monitor, I have to take down Teams in order to put up the documents. So it took me a second to click over. I think going through might be helpful. I know specifically to that policy and the regulations, one of the things that was concerning was that I think we might want to tighten up the language on when exactly the policy can be waived, since it would then be a standing change. Right now it just sort of says, it doesn't say act of God. It says when the superintendent thinks so. So while we have an amazing CEO right now and a great, fabulous team who's incredibly ethical and want to do the best for our students, there could be a space where, say we have high school and we don't have a Washington high school, so I can call it, but Washington high school football coach calls and says, I'm not going to have a team because my starting quarterback is ineligible because of grades. In the language as it's written in the proposed draft, a superintendent could waive the eligibility requirement that year on the basis of they couldn't field a team. So making sure that the rationale and reason for waiving this policy becomes something that supports student athletes and student athlete success rather than something that could be sort of arbitrarily applied. And I would also suggest in the language there, and I know this is just simple wordsmithing, but you have she, he a lot. If we could simply remove all binary language and turn it into they. The superintendent at his or her discretion, the superintendent at their discretion, if we could change that. And that comes up a couple of times in that particular draft language. So with that, if you want to sort of go back to overview piece by piece, unless Commissioner McFadden or Brooks, if you have specific questions you want to ask, we are at 5 o'clock. So we want to be a little expedient, but there's a lot of information in this document.
There is a lot, and Josh, I appreciate the work that you and your team have done around this because it looks very extensive with 31 pages and it's condensed, so I appreciate it. What I would appreciate right now is if I'm looking at the high, what is in red, the priority level for potential revisions, I think it would be helpful for us to just know a little bit more about that process. Will we need to be looking at potential revisions between now and the start of the school year? And what could that potentially look like for us? The others seem to be low and medium, so they need to be on our radar. But these ones that are in red, right, they clearly are things that we need to act on before 2021 begins. So can you just talk a little bit about that? I mean, the considerations that are here, they're clear for me, so I understand why these are high, but just if you could elaborate a little bit on that. I personally don't need you to go through everything, but these high priority things, I would like for them to be lifted a bit.
Sure, and I think this is really the first step of that, to talk it through and also to put out for the public by this committee which ones we are thinking. So we welcome feedback that there need to be more as high. I think on the policy front, and Ms. Houghton can chime in too, there were really two of our policies that we thought were high. One was around compulsory attendance, and the other is, I'm going to get the name wrong, so I just want to refer to it, graduation standards. And both of these pieces, I think my suggestion of a timeline would be that this discussion is an important milestone, and then based on the recovery planning that's underway as we move into July and have clearer understanding of the direction we're headed, and hopefully on both of these fronts get further guidance from MSDE, because graduation standards and attendance are both critical pieces that the state has an important view through COMAR. Then we would bring to you at one of the next board meetings a package for consideration and try to minimize our changes. I think our underlying idea here was, because we're moving quickly, we wanted to minimize the significance of changes so that we were not completely reorienting policies on an emergency basis, but only doing the work that was absolutely necessary to support the crisis management state that we're in.
That makes sense. Ms. Houghton, were you going to chime in? No, I didn't know if you were about to chime in or not, so I didn't want to.
No, I wasn't going to chime in. I think Josh covered everything. I didn't have anything.
Great, so perfect. So then, Josh, are these areas that you and staff are now deeming as high, are they being incorporated into the recovery planning process? Will these somehow be incorporated in what we consider recovery, so that all of the board, all of the public, and all of our stakeholders are aware of this being a part of all of what goes into the recovery process?
Yes, I mean, the issues of attendance, right, and how we are going to determine attendance are a key part. I believe that is one work stream. And then the issue of graduation requirements really goes to the core of what the curriculum of learning is over the course of especially high school. So that is the piece. And I know that there are folks closer to the recovery process attending the committee meeting. So if anybody wants to chime in on that point, I don't want to preclude them from doing so.
I also am assuming with the eligibility for policy EEA and the regs there, with thinking about student transportation protocols and incorporating the social distancing, I think that all really does speak to that recovery planning too. So I don't know. I'm talking through because I'm processing it all as I'm talking. So I am personally relying on you all as experts right now to kind of facilitate this and trusting that you all will bring what is needed in urgent policy revision or things like that to us so that we can act on it in a timely manner.
And Chara, would you like to walk through just quickly the regulations that are high so that the members of the committee understand what regulations may be at stake?
But Josh, with the regulations, with them, the CEO is able to make edits or amendments to the regulations and just provide us with based on, extenuating circumstances or whatever the case may be, and provide us with an update on that, right?
Just like we did today with the eligibility piece. But we want to make sure that we're as open to feedback and engagement as we can on that process too, so that we're going in and people understand the actions that the CEO is taking.
Okay.
So if it works for the two of you, Ronald and Darrell, perhaps tabling a deeper dive on the high level regulations. I think this is something the full board needs to see, not like sort of ad nauseum deep dive, but sent to them as a document and a brief overview so that they get a chance to be sort of prodded to dig in a little bit themselves, because this is so much bigger than just one committee.
To that, Dr. James, I agree. And also, would it be possible, Josh and Allison to also have this go to PCAB, to BTU, to ASCBC, to Pizzazza, to all of our union partners, but those partners that are regular contributors to the work that we do, and to get their feedback on this as well, I think would be helpful and meaningful in the process.
We'd be happy to do that.
And hopefully they'll be receptive of providing authentic feedback as well.
Right, and that was the reference also at the beginning of the summary to stakeholder engagement, because we think that's crucial. And again, given the massive task of making sure that we don't miss anything and committed to going policy by policy and regulation by regulation, we would benefit from multiple eyes on this to flag pieces. And even we learned from following what some of the other districts were doing in terms of their policies and regulations. So the more folks that can dive in here, I think the better that we will all be as a district.
I appreciate that, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. I appreciate that and your attentiveness to that. I think about systems like Prince George's County. They do a lot less policy development versus resolutions to kind of guide what happens in their system. So I know that we're not unique, but we just have. I think our process has become quite extensive when it comes to policy development, the implementation. And so I do agree with you in making sure that we have as many eyes, as many of our stakeholders, and as much of the community as possible engaged in this process, because this is one of the bigger chunks that the board has to lift. So I appreciate that. And I'm done.
Okay, Commissioner Brooks?
Yeah, so I was gonna, I second that. I think I appreciate the naming of the high level pieces, and I think in terms of regs, for me it's important to just kind of know where those changes are, and I'm fine with that. I think, and just to echo Ronald's. Commissioner McFadden's feedback, which is around as much engagement as possible. I think it's
Dr.
great.
Brooks, Ronald is fine. It was taking you a long time to think about what Ronald.
I was blanking on your last name. I was like, why am I blanking? And then to also, I think Martha, you're right in the sense that Commissioner Hassan, that we have this is a big lift, and I think the board. And to whatever degree that they feel compelled to contribute. And so I'm happy with us living with the lion's share of that work and us taking a deep dive in, but also elevating it so that they can kind of weigh in as well.
So thank you very much. I'm trying to get my household to dial the volume down for a second. It got kind of loud in here. One other policy that I think might need to rise to the level of high in looking at it, either the policy or its regulations, is employee evaluations. Just given the intensity of that process, the time stamps on it as we go virtual or remote or be flexible in that. So we might want to think about that. I also really appreciate the work and effort that went into the document for Ronald and Darrell. When we first went in COVID, and I proposed the idea of writing, sort of a draft resolution that said CEO has flexibility. My intent in proposing that as a way to move forward was, if you can imagine, had she had to come to us with each of these changes in real time as they were happening, would have stopped the machine of the school system being able to function, as well as been completely overwhelming for us. So this work is what I was looking for in that original sort of resolution piece, so that we are adhering to policies, and we are being conscientious of the policies that we need to adjust and be nimble with. but that there's some systematizing of it so that that again, the community can trust us to know that we're not just willy-nilly making changes as it suits us or is easiest for us, but we're making the changes that are essential to be best for kids and employees. So thank you. So with that, Christian, do we have any public comment folks today?
Yes, we have 2.
Okay, so before we move to that, I'll just throw it back to Allison, Josh, Joe, Christian. Are there any other things about the agenda that we need to attend to or that you would like to flag for the community or the committee?
I don't. I just wanted to say thanks to Josh and Ms. Houghton for their work to do this. It was a huge undertaking to go through that so quickly and really come through with thoughtful recommendations. So I'm just very appreciative at their work going through that.
Yeah, and when it gets presented to the board organizationally, the way it is great because it's by the sections of the policy. But if we could also put all the things that are of high priority together and medium priority, so that there's sort of 2 versions, so that commissioners that want to dig through and read and be part of each piece can, but everyone can sort of go right away to what's the most impactful or highest leverage or most need. Be great. All right, so with that, oh yeah, go ahead, sorry, somebody wants in. Did I hear somebody wanted in? No? All right, I'm hearing things now. So it must clearly be time to go to public comment. So, Mr. Gant, I'll turn it over to you for that.
Okay, first up is Miss Rachel Duncan on behalf of PCAB.
Thank you, Mr. Gant. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to provide public comment on behalf of the Parent and Community Advisory Board with respect to policies that include a mandatory policy compliance review. PCAB supports the suggestion made at the April 21st Policy Committee meeting to set aside time during policy committee meetings to discuss these compliance reviews. Based on the discussion at the April 21st Policy Committee meeting, it is our understanding that these mandatory policy compliance reviews have previously been circulated only at board executive committee meetings, which are not public and during which policy cannot be discussed. It is also our understanding that these compliance reviews are high level and do not usually have any information about specific schools or specific individuals. Including policy compliance reviews as part of policy committee public meetings will increase transparency for parents and community members and also enable compliance reviews to inform policy development work at the committee level. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments for Ms. Duncan?
Yeah, I would just say thank you. This is Commissioner Brooks. And I think the spirit of where we've been moving, or at least since I've been here and under Commissioner Hassan's sort of leadership to really make sure that those compliance reports are actually publicly discussed so that we could think about how policy is affecting our environment and how it is actually then can be leveraged to create substantive change.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. So Christian, on the policy calendar, would it be possible for us to also co-list those compliance updates that would be available and appropriate for a public audience on that calendar so that people can be proactively ready to participate on those days when policies of import are being presented?
Yeah, Josh Siddon can also jump in on this. I've been having discussions with Joe about that. They're currently in the midst of the review to see which compliance reports would, if there's any privacy concerns or other concerns that would prevent them from being public. And once that review is complete, we'll begin the process of kind of filling in the calendar with some of them. And Joe, Josh, is there anything I'm missing?
Nope, that was completely accurate.
Oh, good.
I think that will also help increase public participation if people know. So someone is really invested in JKA, they know to be watching for that policy compliance report in X month so they can plan to attend and be present. I think that will be very helpful. So thank you, Ms. Duncan.
And this is Commissioner Brooks. And so I wanted to just check in really quickly. Do we have a policy around, I know that most of our information, barring the fact that the, protected information is removed, do we have any policy that suggests that we need to give the public the information in a timely manner and then time that it was requested? Because I know that SOMOS had requested information and it had taken so long for them to get. SOMOS is the student group run out of City College, that it delayed their ability to make some decisions and actions.
I honestly don't know. Josh, do you have a response to that at all? Or Allison?
I mean, there are, of course, NPIA requirements about timing. There's not about other public information, and we try to provide information to people as quickly as we can. Sometimes it requires gathering information that, it takes a minute to gather. We get a lot of information requests, so sometimes that's a challenge, but there is nothing. So NPIAs have timelines, but I don't think there is for other.
And there's some language in, I believe it is, policy KDA. So we can also look at that and follow up.
And I know specifically within policy, Mr. Sivan, there are several that have date stamp timelines from the date they were adopted is usually. So it's an annual report with the expectation that it's given annually per adoption cycle. So,
right.
And especially those that dovetail, like the wellness policy that's a federally mandated policy has dates.
Yeah, I'm talking more about sort of like if someone puts in a request to us and it takes them 3 months to get back to them, like, do we have a policy in place to suggest what is the minimum time frame in which a request for public information is essentially being able to be transferred?
Yeah, so that would be in the data sharing policy, I believe, which I don't remember the letters off the top, but go ahead, Allison. Do you have...
Well, I think Josh is about to say something. I mean, I would think that falls under MPIA, but.
Right. And so if it's an official MPIA, there are state mandated deadlines. And then if it's a request, like a family member, parent requesting student records, there are also timelines under FERPA, which I think are in our student records regulation. And then if it's miscellaneous requests, I think that's KDA. But all of them have prompt deadlines, so we should we can follow up on that and spell some of that out for you if that helps.
And I would say that we do have a process where we do respond to most requests very quickly. So that's part of our weekly meeting that Christian and Joe and I have each week to go through any pending requests for information, not MPIAs, but other requests that are pending. And those are usually closed out within a few days or a week, most of those. So, I mean, there are some exceptions. Sometimes there is information that's a little bit harder to gather, but for the most part, I think we generally are pretty responsive.
Yeah, so it would be, helpful for me to just kind of know those timelines. So if you could pull out those specifically around, I know there was data requested around Latinx students' access to particular high schools, right? And so I think there was a delay in that, which was critical information for them to do their work. And I know that didn't happen in a time frame one that might have been, so it could have been around the expediency in which they requested it, or the fact that we took too long to get it. So I'm not sure, but I just would love any information and guidance around what is our specified timeframes for delivering specific types of information.
Yeah, and I think in that particular situation, it may have been more about the timing of the ask, made it time sensitive, rather than our delay in due process.
Yeah, I think sometimes I have to go back and look at the email exchanges. There was some information that was maybe not ready, but there was information that was provided, and then there was also subsequent requests as if the information was not been provided. So that did happen a couple times too, where we referred back to the other previous information we provided that had answered that request.
And then to your point, Dr. Brooks, that all of this just goes to how we're communicating and working on how we're being transparent and responsive. So when we look at the compliance report around the policies that would have timelines. I would hope to see included in that policy not only how many requests for information, but what was the time to getting the information out, what was the sort of client receiving perspective on getting that information. Was it complete? Did there have to be back and forth? Things like that. Because that's the way that compliance reports can help inform the board's practice to guide the superintendent or the CEO to be more efficient and effective moving forward. All right, anything else around Ms. Duncan's testimony, or ready to move on to the next person?
Yep, I'm ready to move on.
Excellent, okay. Mr. Gant?
Mr. Zach Taylor, representing the BTU.
Hi, good afternoon. Hope you're all doing well. So first, just when considering policy changes, the Baltimore Teachers Union would like the school board to consider policy ICA, school calendar, for this year's upcoming calendar. And really, we'd love to see action this week. As you know, this policy includes the district's and the state's recognition of various holidays. And we strongly urge the board to consider recognizing Juneteenth on June 19th and to have this be no school day this year and every year. Since we regularly go well into June, and we are doing so again this year at the district's choosing, we hope the board considers how important adding Juneteenth to our list to celebrate holidays is, especially in light of the grim situation our country faces with regards to historic and present day racism and white supremacy. Such recognition of this holiday will be powerful, not just for students and staff, but for the entire city of Baltimore. We also have recommendations for the other prospective policy changes, both in general and with regard to COVID-19. As you heard last week, we believe changes to GCO, unannounced formal observations, no longer make sense for next year, and will do more to distract from instruction than improve it. We appreciate the remarks Commissioner McFadden made tonight, this afternoon, and we look forward to any future conversation on this matter. We also really appreciate and echo the concerns referenced by Dr. Brooks with regards to gender identity and expression. And we also hope to be part of these conversations going forward. They're really important. As for policy JFBA, school choice, the board has heard me, BTU, SOMOS, we actually just heard it referenced here. School choice is really a central issue to making the equity policy a breathing, living thing in a way that affects students. And we hope this stays at the forefront of the district's work. If I had more time, I would also talk about some of the timeline issues. We only got stuff moving regarding timelines once we referred to a Baltimore Sun reporter who gave us a scoop saying, actually, this sort of information comes quick to us when we request it. And when we shared that, we were able to get information a little bit quicker from the district. And this is more with regards to SOMOS, less with regards to BTU specifically. Other policies, KIA-RC, classroom observations, really informal observations. This is listed as a low priority, but we just want to emphasize that all observations should be geared towards support and not high stakes evaluations in this unusual environment. And this is true for the virtual setting, but also true if we come under school under new conditions in school where we have to be physically distant from students. And we want to help flesh out this policy in a way that makes sense and is supportive for this new environment, however long we may have it. Also, curriculum is listed as a low priority for change. When this is really a top issue for why students are disengaged, this policy and curricula across a range of content areas weren't made for a virtual format or in-person schooling where we have to be physically distant. And so we really think this requires attention, and we loudly echo the demands of students just more generally around introducing Black American history courses to our curriculum. These aren't present really in any of our schools, and our policy does call for culturally responsive curriculum, and we think this would be one appropriate measure. There's other things I'd like to talk about. I know I'm over time, but we appreciate all the work going forward in this area. There's a lot to do, and we know it requires a lot of attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. One thing that I would say in direct response is, in order to adhere to our policy calendar timeline, we would not be able to honor Juneteenth as a holiday through a policy this year, but we most assuredly could look at putting forth a resolution to do that as a board.
That's great. Yep.
So just to help with that, if we come back with a no, we can't do policy, it's because it takes 3 readers and things like that to do policy.
Yeah, I'm aware. I know it's June 16th, and honestly, we should have brought it up earlier. We're bringing it up now, and appreciate any attention that can be brought to this, Mayor.
And I think that's a great way for us all as a community to look forward. There's a whole lot that we as a community and we as individuals in a community should have done decades, centuries, years ago. But that shouldn't preclude us from doing the right thing now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner McFadden, Commissioner Brooks, any either comments for Mr. Taylor or closing comments?
Yeah, so this is Commissioner Brooks, and I just wanted to, again, thank you, Zach Taylor, for speaking and sort of bringing, I think, really important and critical issues. One of the things that has really stuck out to me is that I think, in addition to our sort of recommitment to our equity policy and making sure that it has teeth, I do think that we as a district need to really authentically consider a rigorous ethnic studies curriculum for our students in the district. And that is the bringing together of multiple racialized experiences and bringing to bear their lived experience through curriculum, through books and art and music and culture. And I think as a district, we should be moving forward into that direction. And then also, just one of the pieces, as I think about our equity policy, and it came to me at commencement this past year, maybe we also, in addition to thinking about how we support LGBT students, currently, to my knowledge, I don't know many high schools that do lavender celebrations for students. And I would actually like the district to sort of develop and adopt a lavender celebration for our students who so wish to attend next year. So those are some of the things that I'll be sort of continuing to sort of talk about and push a little bit more as we move into the next year.
Excellent, thank you. Commissioner McFadden, anything?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, staff. I know it's a Herculean load that we've done and you're working and everybody's surviving the school year. Mr. Gant, do you have the next meeting in front of you? Sorry otherwise I dig through and find it. For July?
I'm pulling up the date up now, July 21st.
July 21st at 3:30, same station. Looking forward to seeing you all there, and know that the board is thinking and doing a lot of work around policy. And again, to Mr. Coven and Ms. how do I say it? Shiraz, how do I say your last name? I don't want to do it wrong. Got it. Excellent. Thank you both very much for your work. Again, Ms. Duncan for being here. Everybody have a lovely, lovely Juneteenth. And a great day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.